You're watching the Eternal Tournament Series.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is the pre-show coverage for the 2018 Season 1 Invitational put on by aReNGee Eternal. Woo! Been a long season getting here, but we are now finally at the point where we are down to 32 players. The best 32 players of Set 3 have proven themselves enough to get here, but who gets to take home part of the $500 prize pool? That's right. We have doubled our prize pool since last year. We now have a $500 prize pool. So as a quick breakdown, I am here with aReNGee, the man himself, the founder of the website, and Sir Rhino, the famous caster, streamer extraordinaire. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing just great. It's a lovely Saturday morning where I'm at, and I'm just excited to see some great Eternal get played today and tomorrow.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Looking forward to our first premier tournament of 2018. Testing out a bunch of new tournament formats for today, so we will see how that goes and how that is received.
Indeed. As aReNGee said, we have a slightly different format for this year's Invitationals. We'll see how well it goes. We'll be checking for feedback from players and viewers and maybe modifying it at some point down the line. But at the moment, our format is as follows. On day one, we have a 7-round Swiss event. Instead of cutting to top 8 or cutting to top 16, we play 7 rounds. Where normally a 32-player Swiss would be 6 rounds. But this means we can cut players based on if they get 4 wins, they go directly to day 2. If you go 4-0, you're done for the day. If you go 4-3, you're done. You've managed to sneak your way in at the end. But both players are making it to the same day 2. And as soon as a player gets 4 losses, they're then mathematically eliminated. So again, if you go 0-4, your day has come to a depressingly short close. But this Swiss will cut our player base from 32 to 16. So half of the players make it to day 2. And the day 2 cutoff is where series points start to come into play, but I'll get to that in a second. So then day 2, we will be going to a 16-player single elimination bracket, no longer double elimination like last year. And in terms of broadcast coverage, we will be showing one of the matches from the round of 16, so the first elimination match of the day. And then from then on, all remaining matches will be broadcast. So you will see every single match in the round of 8, the round of 4, and then, of course, the finals themselves. So, as I mentioned, we have now a $500 prize pool. So first place takes home $200, and they get 12 series points, but of course they will be automatically qualified for Worlds. So really, that's just a leg up in the Player of the Year race. Second place will be getting $100 and 10 series points. Third and fourth will be getting $50 and 8 series points. 5th through 8 will be getting $25 and 6 series points. And 9th through 16th will be getting 4 series points. And once again, series points are how we qualify our players to make it into Worlds if they don't win one of the premier events along the way. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about Dead Reckoning, the latest campaign expansion for the game. Handful of new cards, and we're actually seeing a decent amount of play from a lot of them.
Yeah, Dead Reckoning brought with it 25 new cards. And while they're not all seeing play in this tournament, even the ones that aren't seeing play are still having their presence felt, but more importantly, the ones that are seeing play are really making an impact. As you can see from the graphic here, as far as the premier card seeing play right now, well, there's a lot of Argentport today, so some Argentport cards are getting represented in Rip Knife Assassin and Inquisitor's Blade. In Cold Blood, not a card you're going to play in Argentport, but because you're expecting it, you could play that in response, and also Akaria and other cards like that are popular. So that's showing up a ton as just a card that can strip win cons out of a deck, can randomly be a Death Strike that's actually a 2-for-1 by ripping a card out of their hand, or even, you know, a 3 or 4-for-1 if you're so lucky. And just because the format's been slowing down a bit, there's a little bit less aggro. You can get away with playing Cold Blood, and that's largely due to the card that's all the way on the other side of the screen, Hailstorm.
Yeah. You know, in Cold Blood, if you aren't against Justice, is a slow speed Death Strike. But you know, the decks that kind of punish playing 4-cost removal in general, where, you know, 4-cost removal is kind of considered a bit slow, a bit clunky. You don't want to see multiple of it often. The decks that punish that are kind of not found in the meta recently. We have, this is, you know, jumping ahead a little bit, but we kind of really only have one Skycrag aggro deck as like a real true get underneath, beat them up by turn, you know, 4 or 5 aggro deck.
Right, and then that's largely due to Hailstorm. Even if it didn't show up a lot today, there was the threat that it was going to show up in large numbers.
Exactly.
And that's had a big effect on what kind of early game threats you're playing. Things like just 1 and 2 drop units that exist to do damage, like Pyro Knight or Argentport Instigator, are a little less appealing because they generally won't be able to get in enough damage to matter in a Hailstorm metagame. And that's why we've even seen, you know, the shift to Rip Knife Assassin. At least if that gets off a couple attacks before it gets swept away with alongside like a Valkyrie to a Hailstorm, at least it got a couple War Cries off. And when you top deck it in the late game against mid-range decks, it can still block as a deadly unit.
Yeah, lots of new cards seeing play today. Interesting that it's Argentport that's received the most new options, with 2 cards out of the 5 that are here that slot specifically into that. Duraka, notably, has been a high-end calling card for Primal decks. People talked about it somewhat derisively when it came out, comparing it to Ice Sprite. It turns out, you know, Ice Sprite plus 7/7 is a lot better of a card than a 1/2 flyer. We also see Venom Rider in the FTP Moment sideboard, which is a 3/3 charge deadly for 4 that you can pay 5 to make a little deadly killer. I think it's a Scorpion. Don't recall. The really interesting thing about these cards, aside from what's actually here, is what is not here. We have no copies of Huru Pacifier in the 32.
Yeah, and that in some ways is a little surprising, especially with some of the weapons-based decks showing up, like FGJP Plate is here, but that's a deck that can't play Huru Pacifier because it plays weapons, right? It would love to have a 3/4 Flying Overwhelm, but because you can't play your Hammer of Mights and Deep Forge Plates on it, a little less appealing to play it in that deck. And something like Huru Midrange or Huru Control currently is just not as appealing compared to other mid-range and control options like Feln, which gets to play in Cold Blood, and or even things like Praxis mid-range or Elysian mid-range like we're seeing right now. They're just slightly bigger and better than, and it's a rough spot for, or at least players going in, I assume, thought it would be a rough spot for a Huru mid-range or big Huru style deck that Huru Pacifier can enable.
Really, I think the main question is a lot of players were expecting Argentport as the tier 1 or as the level 1 deck for the tournament, so they were expecting a lot of Argentport, and I don't know if you like Huru too much into a Argentport heavy field. Feels like not quite as good and not favored.
Yeah, Pacifier does line up like okay against Argentport until they slay or silence it, but the thing is, it can still get hit by like the back half of a Runehammer, and it's really like what else in the Huru deck is lining up well against the Argentport deck, and the answer then becomes not a whole lot. You know, Permafrost is okay, Vanquish is okay, but you can run into these, and Hailstorm can be good against Argentport as well. So you have to settle on the right Huru deck to fight Argentport, and then it probably ends up lining up poorly against everything else.
Unfortunately, yeah. You know, Vanquish, of course, probably going to be a very good card in this field, but Huru does kind of have the problem of, well, they only really have 4 potentially copies of the card, and then the other situational removal is a lot more situational nowadays.
Yeah, like one of potentially like the best removal spell is something like in Huru is Bring Down, but that is like a huge call to try and peg on like a field of 32 invitational sort of thing. So not too surprised to see nobody go with that. I know Otrick was playing around with a Huru aggro style deck that could have actually been decent in this field, or was playing like Crown Watch Paladin, sort of unseen base, had topped out at Lita and Shelter Ring Rider. That could have been an intriguing option here, but again, there's a Huru's always one of those decks that people like to flirt with. I remember Bruised by God previously trying Huru Flyers, even on Earthly tried it once. And it's always like almost there, but it feels like we thought Huru Pacifier was a missing piece, and it probably was the missing piece, but people just weren't comfortable with, they couldn't settle on a list that they liked.
Huru's a little bit light on adaptability. A lot of other decks have, powerful sideboard cards and stuff they can move in and out, and Huru, at the moment, it's got a bunch of powerful units, but it's got only Vanquish and Permafrost for removal options really in its entire kit.
Yeah.
And no relic removal, no disruption. Protect just got nerfed, so the adaptability of the deck is pretty low. And players generally like to play things that either have the strongest linear plan or are able to adapt well to what their opponents are doing. So a lot of people have it as like their second or third deck, but it never ends up being the one that they bring.
Yeah, I agree that's Huru is probably the faction combination that lags the most in terms of sideboard options. Omen of Austerity doesn't quite hold up in efficiency or flexibilities compared to something like Boar, which has shown up in decent numbers today in sideboards.
Yeah, Boar is... sorry, aReNGee, go ahead.
No, I was also going to transition into the Boar part. Just we were talking about this in the pre-show. Exclusive about why Boar was showing up today instead of one of the other relic options, and Rhino had a really good point about this card and the fact that it kills relics through Aegis because you get to use multiple copies of it.
Right, so that's really big, not only for hitting face Aegis relics, like say against Chalice, which it can be really useful. And if we see this show up in the sideboards of like removal pile, they don't have a lot of ways to remove face Aegis against a Chalice deck, and you really need to remove the Chalice. But also importantly, FJP Plate showed up as 2 lists today. That deck runs a lot of Aegis units, and what Boar can do is pop the Aegis to either clear the way for removal or to remove the weapon that's on that unit as a follow-up, like a Deep Forge Plate or the hammer, or even the Steel Fang Chakram. So it can just play a nice role as a single card that can actually pop Aegis and then remove the card behind it, which is a really unique and powerful effect that we haven't seen from any other card yet in the game.
It is, of course, to be noted, not a fast spell, unlike, say, Ruin or Decay. Where, against something like FJP Plate, if they put the Deep Forge Plate onto, say, a Whirling Duo or something that just doesn't have Aegis, but this is definitely going to show its weakness compared to Ruin. Being able to ruin off a Deep Forge Plate to throw off combat math, or just not to take an extra 5 overwhelm damage, can be very key in matchups like those. But yeah, against matchups like Chalice, where they're playing, generally speaking, 4 Cobalt Waystone main deck. They may want to, especially if they know their opponent has Relic Hate post sideboard, wait until they found one of their Waystones before they even play a Chalice to begin with against decks that are running Banish, etc., etc. You can't do that against Boar. And especially if you top deck a Boar, a little ways into the game, if you're a control deck, you can pop face Aegis, kill the first Chalice, kill the second Chalice, and of course they've already accrued a good amount of value off of those Chalices. But if you're playing a deck like FJS Removal Pile, hopefully you can manage to keep up with your opponent, getting like 3, 4, 5 Chalice activations off, and still come back and win the game because you have a ton of value cards yourself.
Yeah, there have been some players that are really impressed with this card. Just for one example, Tin Man showed up with a Felnscar control deck today. Only playing 2 fire cards in the entire deck, though. There is 2 main deck Statuary Maiden, and then there's no torch or no extra removal from fire or anything like that. It is just a couple copies of Boar in the sideboard. Those are the only fire cards in the entire 90. So Boar making the cut in that sense as a useful tool that this Felnscar control deck normally doesn't have access to. Feln does not have any way to deal with relics efficiently, and Boar on the splash gives it a nice little kit in the toolbox.
Sorry, let me actually get in one point about the Felnscar control. We've actually had someone do that in the past. I wish I would have thought about this last night and looked it up. But we did have a deck that was Felnscar, Splash, just hard splash, Ruin in the sideboard. Their main deck was, set up in a 3-faction color base. But in the main deck, 0 fire cards. Because as you no way to deal with resolved relics. They can pull them out of your hand, but once they're on the board, they're on the board forever. So Boar and Ruin as splash options can help alleviate that.
I think that was really for Obelisk and Gift rather than the Armory decks that you would have expected it to be for, because funnily enough, Feln doesn't beat Armory. Well, Felnscar doesn't beat Armory either. No matter how much Relicate you really side in. Sort of an archetype mismatch.
I've heard tales of Feln beating Armory in tournaments past, but they're the stuff of legend now.
So I hate to dig in for an Overmaster quote so early in the morning, but is Armory even a bad matchup for Feln? I mean, usually, but it doesn't always play out like that.
Well, post sideboard things do get better for Feln, but if it's favored post sideboard, or if it's favored in a best of 3, given waiting of game 1 versus games 2 and 3, that's a bit more academic.
Yeah, I imagine the loss of Vara certainly shifts the dynamic of that matchup for sure. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But Feln's still playing a fair number of big fatties, and the shift away from Withering Witch in spots probably helps that matchup too. But I mean, Armory, what even is that anymore? Who knows? It's not like we see pure traditional Armory much anymore either. It's shifted mostly towards removal pile or setting up for Icarias. So that we'll see plenty of that today as well. There are no shortage of Icarias and Tavrods going around in combinations of all kinds of decks today. So those that are bringing the 4 of In Cold Blood that we were talking to earlier, there's a good chance that you'll see some sick plays with that card.
Yeah.
So let's transition into what we actually are seeing today. We've been dancing around it a little bit, talking about what's been going on, but let's go to our slides that actually talk about it.
So the boogeyman of the meta, Argenport Midrange is back. We have Argenport Midrange as our most represented deck, coming in at 6 individual decks, so around about 20% of the field, actually just slightly a hair under. But then we see immediately following that up in terms of kind of a concept is you put Praxis Midrange and Zeta Midrange together, and we actually have 7 kind of standard time midrange deck. We have a lot of decks in time, with also Alicia we have 9. But we have some other decks in time. We have Chalice, we have a couple of other decks splashing time. But generally speaking, kind of time midrange used to be the most popular deck for invitationals for a very long time. We saw the Cambrai versus Stone Scar, or time midrange versus Stone Scar matchup as the finals of I believe 4 events running for a while in the previous year. But we don't even have Cambrai represented in the field today at all. We don't have Stone Scar represented in the field today at all. The season 2 invitational finals dream from last year of Cambrai versus Stone Scar forever is finally dead. There is actually no possible way for that combination of decks to meet in the finals because they don't exist.
As neither of them have shown up. The other really interesting thing is that the true most represented deck is actually Other.
That's pretty common, actually.
7 copies across the field, I think, is that number?
Yes,
I'm
7.
not quite sure on the math. So a lot of people brewing for today and playing their own stuff. And other than Argenport midrange, even the decks that are popular aren't that popular, with only 2 or 3 copies across the field. So a lot of diverse looks at the metagame and what people were expecting. It's interesting to see a bunch of Praxis when people were expecting Argenport midrange, as Praxis usually doesn't do that well into Argenport midrange. So interesting to see it as the second most popular deck. Felon Control, people love to bring Felon Control to these events and then not do
Can
very well
confirm.
with them.
Can confirm.
So we'll see if In Cold Blood into Argenport turns that a little bit more in their favor. FJS Removal Pile, good to see into the Argenport mid-range threats that are there. Xenon is the interesting one, depending on how the decks are built exactly. Xenon can line up pretty well against what's going on here, or it can line up pretty poorly. So we'll see how that plays out here. And Chalice is back. We have 2 copies of Chalice. We thought we had gotten rid of it for good, but it's back to haunt us, along with the Boogeyman mid-range decks from the last couple weeks, Elysian mid-range and FJP Plate. So a whole rainbow of decks here.
Yeah, not too surprising that people settled on Argenport mid-range as the kind of default safe pick here with the new Inquisitor's Blade. It has a funny angle of being a little more evasive in spots, and now with aggro kind of gone, it doesn't have to worry about the getting run over downside that Argenport sometimes can have because it just plays, 1 unit, 1 threat a turn for basically the entire game. Protect getting nerfed did hurt it a bit, but also it just opened up its ability to play a couple more cards in the spots that it was playing those protects in a bit. And what it did, the big change for it now in a lot of these lists, not all of them, some players are still sticking to Impending Doom, but there's a number of players that have switched to Crown Watch Trader as a card that dodges Vanquish, Annihilate, and Permafrost. So, you lose your protection for your best threats. Maybe you switch it from being a big flyer to being a big quick draw unit that happens to dodge a lot more removal, especially with Torch being played a lot less in this metagame. As you notice, there's Praxis mid-range on this, and then FJS removal pile, and then not a ton of Torch compared to the past, right? Torch has been one of the strongest cards in the game for a long time. This is a pretty low representation for that card overall, and that also helps Crown Watch Trader, where it can die to Torch at least on your own turn. So those combination of factors helped it kind of rise to the challenge of meeting a new metagame and seeing more play.
I will say that Torch is still being played in 14 of the 32 decks.
Yeah.
But when you look at previous years, that really is a downtick in the rate of how many decks are playing Torch. Torch could have been considered the barrier to entry. You cannot ride this ride if you don't have 4 torches in your deck, or at least your ride isn't going to go very well.
Yeah, and that's sort of, again, a ripple effect from Hailstorm, right? If people are playing less things that die to Hailstorm, they're also playing less things that die to Torch. And that's making Torch worse, and Torch is also being played in the decks that generally had the most units that died to Hailstorm, right? It's this sort of cascading effect, and while Crown Watch Trader does die to Torch, it doesn't die to Hailstorm because of when it has its 5 health versus its 3 health.
Mm-hmm. So we talked before a little bit earlier about Stonescar and Combray missing. The other old stalwart Torch archetype that's no longer present is Rhino. Everybody was talking about Rhino as one of the better aggro decks to be on, but with the advent of Hailstorm, killing, I think, literally your entire deck, that deck has phased itself out. Now, Rhino was never that popular a tournament list. Always very low represented. Even when it was good, people didn't like to be thought of as, the Rhino guy, even though these same players would jump on the chance to be the Stonescar guy, which is always a little weird to me. The invitationals generally trend towards slower decks. The higher curve mid range, the control decks. People like to have more, longer games, more play, unless they commit themselves to a really linear deck. And we're not seeing too much of that into an expected field of, a lot of Argent Port and a lot of Hailstorms were expected. There are 7 copies across 32, which is 20% of the field. Argent Port is back on the Bloodletter plan, so it's better at racing. And aggressive decks just aren't lining up too well against a lot of what was expected.
Yeah, and while Ricano is gone, FJP plate kind of takes its spot where, in terms of Voltron up a unit with a big weapon, but now your units up front don't need the synergy to build and off each other and kind of snowball, right? Old Ricano was all about getting that turn 1 Oni Ronin down, getting the snowball rolling so that your future threats dodged more removal and were more effective. Now, with removal pile being as popular as it is, Argent Port midrange and Hailstorm, this combination of factors, your upfront unit quality needs to just be a little bit higher. So that's where FJB plate comes in terms of, Whirling Duo and Unseen Commando still die to some of these removal spells, but when they don't, they get a lot of value in. And something like Vadius is just a really strong card that wears weapons really well.
So Oni Ronin might be at its actual worst in this tournament. I don't think we see it outside of potentially that one Skycrag list that we have. But like Argent Port midrange has Varus Favor, Felon Control, Varus Favor, FJS, every removal spell on the planet, Xenon midrange, Varus Favor. It's just, there's nothing that you actually want to turn 1 Oni Ronin into except for Praxis. And you can beat Praxis without Oni Ronin.
Yeah, there is one deck out of 32 with Oni Ronin, which, as you said, is pretty wild. It's, in a way, it's gotten better in terms there's less Argent Port Instigators lying around and another 2/3s to get in its way to swing on turn 2. But there's just also bigger and better threats coming down the line that can get in its way that are much harder to remove now. You're either they're either dodging the torch you have and the vanquish between all of the big mid-range units coming down, and it's tough for these Oni Ronin decks to keep up with slightly bigger but still aggressive decks. And that's what we're seeing here. Again, no Stone Scar is totally wild. Like, who could have ever thought that would happen in a field of 32?
Well, I mean, you got to look at the player base that you have. And for this particular tournament, we had a lot of players whose deck range could kind of be predicted. They only played 1 or 2 things. All of the, we'll call them tournament regulars, looked to Argent Port and didn't find anything better than Argent Port, so they were on that. So, you have to be a player who's willing to be the aggressive player and thinks Stone Scar is good, and we just didn't have too many of those into the expected Hailstorm setup.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's shocking now, but more if we were to go back just a few months and been like, there's a tournament that's coming up, no Stone Scar, you'd be pretty surprised at the idea, because for the longest time, Stone Scar, even in tournaments where it was maybe a little bit weaker, it has always just been this presence. Bandit Queen would always show up in some numbers because that card is really strong. And the combination of Hailstorm and more life gain units and all other kinds of other factors just ultimately discourage players from playing it.
So I'm personally always amused whenever I hear someone say something like aggro is dead, we need to bring back aggro, because if you were playing a year ago, you would know that this was the absolute high point for Stone Scar hate, and players were sick of that deck and never wanted to see Stone Scar or aggro again. So
to be fair, around about a year ago, I think may have been right before or right after the Champion of Chaos is no longer a 5/5 change.
I think the one that we got in March, we got the influence changes for Umbran Reaper and Soulfire Drake.
Yeah,
I think that was the first one we got, and then they kicked Champion of Chaos when it was down in June, something like that.
Yep, Champion of Chaos, then Flame Blast and Rapid Shot. Yeah, lots of hits to Stone Scar, and it kept trucking along anyways.
But a lot of good cards a year ago.
Yeah, it still has a lot of good cards. It's just now some of the other faction combinations have caught up in terms of ability to deal with their threats or erase their threats.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump ahead real quick to the next way we're breaking down the meta here. So I will say, as a quick note about this faction representation chart, this does not account for the weight of the faction's representation. So a deck that has 3 colors, say FTP Moment counts as a deck that has Fire and Time and Primal, whereas a deck, say, like Xenon counts as a deck that has Shadow and Time. It doesn't matter if they're 2-faction or 3-faction. But taking that into account, we see a fairly even distribution of all of the factions are being represented fairly evenly, which is maybe a little different than some invitationals we've seen before, where, say, Justice or Shadow was kind of the standout, or Time was kind of the standout of in like 23, 24 out of the 32 decks. Of course, we see Primal down at the tied for lowest, but that really isn't a surprise.
Well, Primal got a lot of pretty good cards in Dead Reckoning in particular. We didn't, or we only briefly touched on Duraka. Hailstorm we've mentioned. Hoover Pacifier is not at this event, but that's a pretty good card. So the Primal doesn't get good cards. This time it got a couple. Shadow's still highly represented, with Argentport, Feln, and FJS leading the way. But 18 copies, or 18 decks that are running some amount of Shadow, compared to 14 for Primal and Time. It's not really that wide a band. It's by no means pure dominance by a single thing. So you can kind of play the factions that you want to play at this tournament.
Especially when you consider that Argentport was like the deck. Argentport midrange was the most represented deck, going back to our last graphic. This chart is even more encouraging once you take that into consideration. It's like, all right, once you sort of discount the fact that a lot of players are just going to bring this super consistent Argentport midrange list, and that's why those bars are slightly higher. It really does show the balance of relative faction representation here. Again, we didn't jump into how deep into these factions are they, but a lot of these Primal decks are probably the Hailstorm decks, but there's also the Fire Justice Primal Plate deck, which is barely a Primal deck, but it's still using Primal cards to some effect, and that does matter.
So the interesting part, and I touched on this a little bit before, is the archetype breakdown that's on the left-hand side here, which I personally believe is probably wrong. We talked about we having 1 copy of Skycrag, and I have to imagine that 9% comes from adding the 2 FJP plate decks.
FJP plate is maybe straddling the line between aggressive mid-range and aggro. But I would also personally argue that the Inquisitor's Blade iterations of Argentport midrange are only maybe just a hair slower than FJP aggro, or FJP plate rather, themselves. I've been playing a lot of that deck on ladder recently, and curving Chronowatch Paladin into 3-drop into Inquisitor's Blade or Chronowatch Paladin, you kill people dead real quick.
It's always a tough call of where to draw the line in terms of calling something aggro or mid-range, because a lot of them are both. Like, you can be an aggressive mid-range deck, and it's like, well, do you have to play Oni Ronin to be an aggro deck, or do you just have to be setting up a kind of linear beatdown plan, which is what FJP plate is doing?
Yeah, with how many good sweepers exist, you're starting your curve at 2, but just having a glut of 2 and 3, and then like some support cards at 3 and 4 and maybe 5, maybe the way we see aggressive, if not strictly, 14 1-drop aggro style decks going forward. And with the addition of a little bit of crests mixed in to fix things a little bit, people are sorry. People are playing a lot more 3-faction aggro decks. We see FJP Plate. We've seen some dabbling in FJP or FJS Gunslingers, where these decks don't have like a turn 4 Goldfish. They're not going to be rallying you for an extra 15 damage on turn 4. But they do definitely have the potential to beat you down by turn 5 or 6. A deck like FJP Plate can still curve 2, 3, 4, 5, plate you, and you're dead.
Mm-hmm. All right, question of the day. Is Second Blue's Grenadin list a mid-range or a control deck?
I think Grenadin generally plays out as a control deck.
Yes, I have generally classified it as a control deck. It kind of is a little back and forth, and he has the one of Kalas in the main. I was considering calling it a combo deck for a second. No.
Yeah, 0% combo decks today.
We did see Elf Scream in the win-ins yesterday. Unfortunately, Ben Buford did not make it in. And that's kind of tempo, combo, mid-range. Decks like that are very hard to classify into a straight category.
Yeah, Eternal does a pretty good job of blurring a lot of lines in terms of traditional archetypes and what goes where. So while it's fun to look at these numbers, there's also a hint of subjectivity to all of it that we've got to take into account. Yeah. So I'm sure somebody will point to this and freak out, but I think it's overall the more exciting thing to see here is even usually in an invitational style tournament with a low player cap and people knowing who is coming, you can really get inbred and super techie metagames where there's only a few decks. And now the fact that there's this much variety, I think, is a testament to Eternal right now.
Yeah. So these archetypes only paint the very broadest of strokes in terms of deck speed and what's going on here. The previous chart that we had up where it broke down what decks were there were more nuanced and also more promising. I think we had 7 major archetypes represented across a bunch of different factions. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so 8 decks with multiple copies, which not bad. Argenport a little bit overrepresented for a truly open metagame, but you had some room to maneuver.
And even the Argenport decks, it's really kind of a split in how they're built. We kind of have the Bruised by God Inquisitor's Blade style, and we have the slightly slower Unearthly style, which Unearthly and Pupicitus are both bringing up with members of Team Owls and Dragons, bringing very similar lists. That aren't running the Inquisitor's Blade are a hair slower. Although they've now all started to run Rip Knife Assassin as the 2-drop, as one of the 2-drops of choice.
Are they running Crown Watch Trader?
They're running it as a 2-of instead of a 4-of.
Interesting.
But they also are running Impending Doom alongside of it as a 4-of. So they still
they're only running 6 4-drops. Yeah.
So they still do want it's possible they just wanted a little bit more big unit density, but without running the Paladin plus Inquisitor's Blade package, the deck just is a little bit slower. It has a bit different of a feel to it. It's kind of the set to post Horus Traver standard for Argenport mid range. Of course, take out the protects, plug in Rip Knife Assassins, fiddle with the numbers a little bit here and there. But it very much plays out like that deck.
Mm-hmm.
It's also notable that Argenport midrange now is like the 2-drops of choice are because they don't have to block as much because there's not aggro. It's Crown Watch Paladin and Rip Knife Assassin. Like they are all Warcry units, and what that's doing is making their other mid-range threats that normally die to Hailstorm less likely to. And that's kind of the big dynamic here is because Hailstorm pushed out some of the really low-to-the-ground aggro decks, Argenport got to change up what its 2-drops are to be better against mid-range and other removal decks, and it's, again, cascading effects. It's really, really interesting to see how this has all played out since not only Dead Reckoning dropped, but the balance changes before that. That the combination of everything has really introduced a churn to this metagame.
Yeah. It's certainly going to be interesting to see, especially post Invitational, how these decks, if we do see one Argentport mid-range come out as the clear winner, is the Inquisitor's Blade package going to be considered, a cute idea but a gimmick? Or are we going to see that becoming, a 13-8 flying Tavrod is clearly the right way to play Argentport mid-range? Or are we going to see both of them survive? Maybe we even see, Unearthly versus, one of the 4 people on the Bruised by God style Argentport mid-range in the finals. Proving both decks really are kind of the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So speaking of who's going to be in the finals, I know we're talking a lot about decks sight unseen, but now let's talk about players sight unseen. We did some top 8 predictions for this event, both myself and rekenner. I historically have a horrific record of predicting the top 8 of events, doing best when I predicted the top 8 of the Season 5 Invitational, which I did in the middle of the season before we knew who was at the tournament or what the metagame was going to look like, with a mighty 4 out of 8 correct. So 50% sight unseen is the best I can do with blind guesses. I think at not at Worlds, but at MSN, I think I was 1 for 8 or something.
I believe that was the case.
That's my low point. So we'll have to see how we did today. Unfortunately, we only have the 2. So Rhino did not submit his predictions in time. So Rek, take us through yours.
All right. So
the hows and whys.
Ooh, and the hows and whys. All right. So just a quick run-off list. I predicted Bruised by God, Kamado, Child Roland, Danabor, Level 13 David, Muxask, Second Blue, and Unearthly. So I think you and I both kind of agree on, kind of why we're bringing Unearthly and Bruised by God and Kamado and Second Blue. They've all just either proved themselves in, over the span of their career, in the form of Unearthly and Kamado. And while they didn't have, super standout win multiple weekly seasons this season, they've had outstanding careers. And then Bruised by God and Second Blue have kind of been 2 of our players to watch this last season in Season 1 of 2018 and for Bruised by God in Team League. As we've talked about multiple times on, Best of 3 and so on and so forth, Second Blue kind of did some carrying in Team League. He had the most 3-0 sweeps of any player. He had a 70% win rate. Bruised by God, I'm sorry. Bruised by God had more sweeps than any other player. Bruised by God had a 70% match win rate over the Season 1 with something like 40 matches played, which is really absurd. We've seen a little bit better, but I would also argue, Angry Chicken had a 75% win rate, I believe it was, in his debut season.
Mm-hmm.
Season 3 of last
year. A much smaller field.
Yes, into a smaller field, and you can argue a weaker field in terms of, relative game knowledge. This season was the biggest field we've ever had, arguably the most competitive field we've ever had. Bruised by God, 70% win rate, insane. Second Blue as well. He didn't have quite as high of a win rate. It was about, I believe, 68%. But that was over 60 matches, approximately.
Yeah, and 3 second places, which can't be discounted. We've never seen that since Rewind did it in Season 1, which was in a field of about 12 players per tournament.
Yeah.
So 12 players versus 120. I'd say it's about 10 times as large.
Yeah, right about.
So very impressive for him.
So the picks where we differ are Child Roland, Danabor, Level 13 David, and Muxask. Child Roland's always been a player that's low key, maybe not low key in terms of you won an invitational, he, was at World, but kind of is always low key impressed me. At least I seems like I've been a bit more impressed with him than other people have been overall. I was hoping he'd bring something a bit more aggressive, but he's on the Bruised by God, Inquisitor's Blade, Argentport, but maybe that really is just the most aggressive you can be without the risk of running into one too many hailstorms and your tournament life just being over because of one card.
Child Roland, traditionally of Stone Scar aggro affair, right? Did so well with Queen in the past, and I believe qualified off the back of Stone Scar Gunslingers for this tournament.
Yes. He won a tournament playing Stone Scar Gunslingers. I also been a Skycrag player when Stone Scar was looking a bit less favorable. Yeah. And he has of course dabbled in time mid range here and there, but really he's an aggro player.
Yeah, so him showing up with 0 torches is quite the surprise.
Yeah. Danabor,
you're a sucker for Ikaria Blue.
Exactly.
He plays only Ikaria Blue.
Surprise! I'm an Ikaria Blue fanboy. He played a lot of Ikaria Blue. He impressed me. He's not on Ikaria Blue today, sadly. Another Trumpets is on Ikaria Blue, another player who played a lot of it during the season. But Danabor is on Chalice. I think a player who's experienced in the control matchups, experienced in control mirrors, is going to have a good time in this field. It's a slow field, and Chalice can go over the top of every one of these time mid-range decks. Elysian gives it a little bit of trouble in terms of just being able to beat it down before it can set up a wall with infinite blockers and removal spells. And the traditional menace for was Cabre versus Chalice. Cabre just basically didn't have a shot into that matchup without extreme luck one way or the other. But it's still a deck that goes over time mid-range, can even go over the top of most other control decks. And, he even named his deck Lock, Stock, and 2 Smoking Chalices, which I got to give him credit for. And then level 13 David and Muxosk, both over the span of, level 13 David's been around since the dawn of time. He was an early closed beta player, but both of them kind of impressed me with bringing interesting decks this season. Sadly, they're both, sadly, level 13 David is kind of on a stock deck today. Although Muxosk is on FTP, Moment of Creation, Curiox Relic Package. Mm-hmm. The batteries special, as it were.
Yeah, it lines up pretty well against Argentport, and I don't know if it has any other matchups that I like.
Wow.
But that might be enough in this field. Who knows? I know I gave FTP Moment Curiox a little bit of a run this last week because I did like how it looked with the addition of Hailstorm and Equivocate. It did not go so well for me, but maybe in the hands of a more experienced pilot, we can really see what it can do.
Hopefully so. aReNGee, how about your predictions? Where you differ from me? What do you think?
So I've always been a big fan of consistency on these lists, which has worked out about 40% of the time. So maybe I should stop. I should see the consistency of that and stop doing for these. But obviously, Kamado, world champion, no complaints here. Second Blue and Bruised by God have had incredible seasons, and I don't see any reason for them to stop just yet. rekenner's typing might be the loudest thing in this part of the universe right now. Unearthly was... I did pick Unearthly with you. I'm not sure about this one. He's one of the best pilots in the game when he's on a deck that he favors, so I thought if he brought Argentport, he would be sure to do pretty well. He usually gets the top 8. It's getting past there that's always been the problem for him. We have high expectations, and well, he was last year's Player of the Year, so let's see if he can do it again. For the ones that we differed with, Fair Odds Bro had almost as good of a season as Second Blue. Bar a match win or two. You know, he mostly stopped at top 4, unlucky, with only 3 top 8s to Second Blue's 4. So another huge season for him, and I expect big things out of him as well. Harad only showed up in the last week of the tournament, but he top 8'd with Felon Control and then won the last chance qualifier with Felon Control again. So the guy's clearly, you know, a pretty good pilot. Expected him to bring Felon Control again today. He did. It seems positioned okay. You know, if he can catch the Argentport mid-range decks where he wants them, he's going to be pretty successful there. Kang Breath wasn't too, didn't make too much of a splash in the regular ETS tournaments, but he was doing some big work out in Team League for his team. Not quite Bruised by God carry level, but he was doing all right. He had a couple sweeps of his own, and he only played 4 tournaments, and he still qualified pretty easily for the ETS. So he's got a good conversion ratio for top 8, and I think he'll be able to do it again here. And my last pick is Missing Toes, who just sparked from nowhere to, I think, second or third place the Season 5 Invitational, and then was kept out of the Season 6 Invitational when his country's entire power grid went out, and for a month. So, as long as he's connected, he can do some great things, and I expect a lot from him here today as well.
Now, you guys made these predictions before seeing deck lists?
That's correct, yes.
Yes, before seeing the deck lists. We made them on Tuesday night, I believe.
Are there any you would change now that you've seen deck lists, such as, I don't know, aReNGee, somebody that you picked had for Champion of Mystery in the main deck, which I know is a card you love a lot?
So I believe you're referring to Bruised by God, and he surprised me. He didn't go with his Argenport list, which I thought was pretty good. He went with Xenon. I think a bigger Xenon as well. But Bruised by God is a master of the mid-range archetype, and he's also a very good deck innovator. We saw him bring Hoover mid-range when nobody was playing it. People started copying that. Then he played Argenport Valkyries. People started copying that. Then he had last week's Argenport list, which a bunch of people are on. The guy's very good at being a step ahead of the game, and if he's doing something and no one else is doing it, it's usually going to be pretty good. So I'm surprised to see Xenon, but I expect a lot out of it. The list is very interesting, and I know we have a deck tech from him coming later on, so it'll be really interesting to see that.
Yeah, I really like his list. I was more interested to see what you had to say, so I'm glad to see you're still backing up your predictions there. I can respect that.
Yeah, the BVG special is always going to be something special.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we need to be wrapping up in the very near future, but let's real quick take a look at a couple of the interesting decks for today, specifically Muxos's FTP Moment Curiox list, just because we're going to be featuring that in round 1 coming up in around about 10 minutes.
Ooh. Okay, so I have a lot of those points that Rhino was expecting me to make about BBG's deck, but I've saved them for the FTP deck. But I'll let someone go over what this deck does before I talk about what it doesn't do.
So this is kind of a controlling-ish deck. It sadly is missing sweepers that are non-conditional sweepers. It doesn't have harsh rule, just because it's not, of course, running Justice. But with the addition of Hailstorm, the Lightning Storm, the 2 to 3 cutoff point is really big in terms of what it can just kind of sweep up with it. So this deck kind of does gain a little bit of ground against aggro. It's missing good removal from mid-range threats, though, unfortunately. It's running the 4 Equivocate. If it turns your opponent's Sandstorm Titan into, a 3/3, then hey, success. The card is no longer really playable. But it doesn't have Vanquish. It doesn't have Death Strike or In Cold Blood or Annihilate. It's got Permafrost and Torch. So it's kind of just hoping to play a lot of bodies and make it so its mid-range opponents can't get through. And then eventually it'll play, a Moment of Creation for 12-12 Titan or 12-12 Sentinels and beat through that way. Rhino, you said you had been playing this deck recently. What are your thoughts on it?
I think Equivocate was and Hailstorm were huge gains for this style of deck because before you had Equivocate, you really didn't have any good removal for something like a Tavrod other than simply polymorphing it. But Equivocate is a better main deckable card that's more flexible in what it can do. It can be good against decks that are putting weapons on units because you can make the weapon fall off and return that unit to hand. Using Equivocate essentially will downgrade a unit in almost every time you use it. So it is a really nice card to have around. The other big thing here is that while, as you were talking about, it doesn't have great answers to mid-range units that dodge Permafrost, the addition of Hailstorm actually helps with that as well, as it can turn dead torches into upgraded removal spells, right? You can Hailstorm away one unit, deal damage to another, then have Torch finish it off. So that combination of cards gives it much better answers to dealing with the threats your opponents are presenting. My bigger issue with this deck that I was running into is how it handles like the removal pile Ikaria decks. Essentially, because you're so light on threats and they don't apply pressure all that quickly, it's pretty easy for these removal pile and control decks to answer the threats you're throwing at them and eventually just bury you in card advantage because they just have slightly better draw engines and value engines than you do, as you have to connect with Curiox for you to get the draw 3 from it.
So when I look at this list, I see a deck built on some of the most gorgeous premium cards in the game. There's a lot of very pretty cards here, and I have to imagine that was the plan when we were building this deck, because it does not look all that cohesive. Curiox has no relics to activate it. You know, there's no power stones, there's no obelisks or anything. So we got a 6-mana 5/5 floating around. Yeah, Heart of the Vault's a good card, but the rest of your deck is the best of the FTP removal suite, which is bad. Quite frankly, into a mid-range metagame. So I don't see how this deck is going to win if it can't land one or probably two big moment of creations. So it is running the full 4 copies, and it's good to see that commitment there. But with only Strategize and Wisdom for card draw, I'm not sure how often this deck's going to be able to land that, and it's not like it has Channel the Tempest or any really big card advantage engines. So it's going to have a difficult time stalling. Its removal doesn't necessarily line up that well against the field, and the sideboard, once again,
the sideboard is interesting.
There's a lot of stuff here.
I kind of like the idea of Sunken Tower plus like Venom Rider. You know, you get a second deadly killer activation. You know, Sunken Tower plus Cerso. Cerso doesn't care about being reckless. He probably wants to swing every turn anyway. But yeah, you know, I can agree that maybe this deck doesn't meet the field very well.
Yes.
Yeah, in my experience with the deck, I was trying to improve on what I perceived as like my issues with the build that you were talking about, aReNGee. Like like Heart of the Vault's a good card, but it's hard on the power base. It is just a thing that replaces itself, and if you're not putting enough pressure in front of it, it's honestly not that impressive. So what I was trying with the deck was to even go a little bit harder on the spell angle, and I was trying Torgovs and scouting parties in the list as a way to kind of diversify the threats and up the amount of card advantage you can generate and card draw. And it felt good, but it still didn't quite feel good enough for me to be like super happy with the deck. But we don't see any of those cards here, but I think it's something to keep in mind for the viewers at home. If you're looking to take this for a spin, you know, don't be afraid when trying to innovate to kill off sacred cows like Heart of the Vault or even Sandstorm Titan, to really try and push this energy and see where the deck can go if you embrace it.
So we're probably going to want to get going right at 11, so we're not going to want to spend too much time on this, but Second Blue is playing a relatively stock Grenadins list. We've seen it before. You know, it's got the Gear Crunchers, it's got the Scrap Tanks, it's got the Scrappers. So how do you like FTP Moment into Grenadins?
I do like the main deck Hailstorms against Grenadins. Sadly for Muxosk, it does not kill Gear Cruncher, the body itself, although if you take away all the Grenadins around Gear Cruncher, it's a lot less threatening. Hailstorm does notably clean up a Scrap Tank, where Lightning Storm just gives you a 7/7 angry scrap tank after the fact.
So, from my angle, it's going to be very difficult for Muskox to actually win the game.
Hmm.
Curiox is his only way to evasively get through the Grenadins. You know, the moment of creation tokens, they don't have Overwhelm, Heart of Vault, no Overwhelm, Sandstorm Titan, no Overwhelm, and no other real win conditions. So, yeah, maybe Muskox is going to clear the board 1, 2, 5, 17 times. But the Grenadin are going to keep popping out, and I don't see too much in the sideboard that's going to change that. Maybe if he can land a Flamestoker, he can get there, but unless Grenadins get an awkward draw and FTP can suddenly go aggro, it's going to be very difficult for FTP to outlast the Grenadins into the late game.
Yeah, I think you definitely nailed it with the take of just how does the FTP deck win? Like, that's the biggest thing. Even if they find a way to manage most of the threats from Grenadin, their units are all on the ground with no evasion other than Curiox, and Grenadin simply just have to save a Combust or a Madness for Curiox, and boom, the rest just go into Chump Block City, and FTP won't be able to overcome the card draw engines and value engines that Grenadins present. So this does look like a pretty tough matchup for this Moment deck. But in the sideboard, the Caleb's Choice can come in, and that could be useful. But other than that, I'm not seeing a whole lot that it gains, even post-board.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to step away for a minute. This is going to bring us to the end of the pre-show as we get the actual tournament set up. So we're gonna take a little bit of a break, and when we come back, we should be back with some round 1 action with our casters.
All right. See y'all later. I'll probably be back to do the outro, and we will be doing another pre-show tomorrow morning, once again, starting an hour before the tournament. So 11 o'clock Eastern time. And then the tournament, again, will be starting tomorrow at the same time as today, 11 a.m. Eastern. So, yeah, we'll see you all later.